In the late 1990s, a darkness fell upon the vibrant markets, bustling streets, southeastern Nigeria. It was a time when fear had a name, whispered in hushed tones. Abba, Onitsha. The name was often that of a local armed robber, a kidnapper, a man who held life as cheaply as the counterfeit currency that sometimes passed through the market stalls. The police, the very people sworn to protect, seemed either powerless or complicit. Their uniforms were often just another costume in the grand, tragic play of corruption and inefficiency. People felt abandoned, left to the mercy of wolves that roamed freely in broad daylight, their confidence a mockery of the law. This was the air we breathed. It was thick with uncertainty. You would leave your home for the market, your heart a tight knot in your chest, praying you would return with your wares and your life intact. The stories were everywhere, told by a neighbor whose shop was emptied overnight, or a cousin who was carjacked on the highway. These were not distant tales. They were the lived realities of our brothers, our mothers, our friends. The state had failed its most basic promise, to keep its people safe. It was a profound betrayal, a deep wound in a resilient, industrious people. The cries for help seemed to echo into a void. Petitions were written, leaders pleaded, prayers were offered in churches and homes, asking for deliverance. But attacks continued, more audacious each day. Criminals were known figures, flaunting wealth without fear, a glaring reminder of a broken system. To understand the rise of the Isakaba, one must first understand the world that created them. The late 1990s and early 2000s. Nigeria emerged from the long shadow of military rule, stepping uncertainly into a new democratic era, clouded by old problems. The economy struggled, unemployment was rampant, an idle, disenfranchised generation primed for chaos. A perfect storm fueled a catastrophic rise in violent crime, particularly in the commercial heartland of the southeast, Abba, Onitsha, becoming virtual war zones. Armed robbery became an enterprise, organized, ruthless, operating with military precision, terrorizing neighborhoods, hijacking buses, raiding markets. Names like Derico Nwamama and Chiajina were brands of terror. They ruled criminal empires the security forces could not dismantle, leaving citizens to fend for themselves in near-total anarchy. Underfunded, undertrained, and plagued by corruption, the police offered little comfort. Reports met by demands for fuel money. An insult to victims who had lost everything. Trust broke completely. The sanctuary became another place of extortion. The state's failure created a vacuum. Taxpayers, citizens, hardworking people felt the social contract torn to shreds. When government cannot protect life and property, people seek protection elsewhere. Forge their own brand of justice, however crude or brutal. The stage was set for a powerful grassroots response to chaos. The breaking point came in Abba, a city built on the sweat and ambition of its traders. Ariaria market was bleeding. Robbers were not just stealing goods, they were killing hope. In 1999, the shoe manufacturers, a powerful, organized bloc, decided they could no longer wait for a savior. They formed a vigilance group to police their lines and protect livelihoods. They called themselves the Bakassi Boys. Their name nodded to a tough, contested peninsula, a signal they were ready for a fight. Mission: eradicate violent crime. No complex legal frameworks, no lengthy trials, no appeals. They were not policemen, they were exterminators. Young, able men from the community, who knew both streets and suspects. They armed themselves not with guns, but with machetes and charms, mixing force and mystic belief. Their presence was immediately felt, a stark, terrifying contrast to ineffectual police. Popularized by a Nollywood name, they ran on community intelligence. People whispered names and locations they never told police. A suspect was seized, interrogated on the spot. Justice as spectacle. Their defining symbol was the machete, and a feared mystical test. If the blade turned red, guilt was certain, and death immediate, merging street justice with mysticism, casting them as divine instruments to many. The methods of the Isakaba were brutal, a raw answer to a raw problem. A suspect identified through community intelligence faced a mystical test. The punishment was swift, public, and final. There was no due process, no presumption of innocence. Guilt, once determined by opaque criteria, was met with terrifying force. Accused paraded, humiliated, executed with machetes. Bodies were dismembered, set ablaze, a gruesome warning to would-be imitators. Horrific as it sounds, it was disturbingly effective. In months, crime rates plummeted. The reign of robbers broke. Those who swaggered fled or hid. People felt security again. Market women displayed wares. Drivers traveled with less dread. A semblance of peace returned. Executions were psychological warfare. Public, ritual, declaring absolute power and cleansing the community in their telling. They traded rule of law for the rule of the machete, backed by myths of bulletproof bodies and potent charms, demoralizing enemies and elevating themselves to demigods. Even police hesitated. This fusion of force and mystical invincibility made them nearly unstoppable in their early days. No story cemented their legend like the capture and execution of Okwudili Ndiwe, Derico Nwamama. By 2001, Derico was the most wanted in Anambra, robber king, responsible for murders, robberies, kidnappings, seemingly untouchable. Governor Chinwoke Mbadinuju faced immense pressure. Police had failed repeatedly. In desperation, the state invited Bakassi boys from pacified Aba to restore order. Crowds cheered their arrival. With local informants and fearless methods, they dismantled his gang piece by piece. On a Tuesday in July 2001, acting on a tip, they cornered Derico on a bus. The king fell with a whimper, not a bang. Paraded through the streets to Ochanja in front of a roaring crowd, they delivered their verdict, accusing him of countless atrocities. Then, before the public, they beheaded him. His head, held aloft, became a symbol of victory over darkness. It was their crowning achievement, the moment vigilantes became mythical heroes in a grateful public's eyes. The arrival of the Isakaba drew overwhelming support. Before them, chaos. After, peace. They were seen as saviors. They were our boys, protecting our communities. People offered information, food, money. Grassroots support became their bedrock. Supporters pointed to results, reopened businesses, later evenings, fear receding. Yet whispers of dissent grew. Human rights groups, lawyers, intellectuals called it extrajudicial killing. No one should wield life and death power without law. What if a personal enemy was falsely accused? As power grew, accusations rose, settling personal scores, business disputes, even political rivalries. A person labeled a robber had no defense. Cheer turned to fear. Protector blurred into oppressor, an arbitrary, unaccountable terror. The Isakaba's influence was profound and complex, two sharply contrasting edges. They restored a measure of order, showing united communities could reclaim safety and agency. Peace was tangible, felt in daily life, yet forged in blood and fire. But their methods undermined rule of law, normalizing violence as a solution and sidelining judiciary and police. They set a precedent for lethal non-state force, a model others replicated. Formal incorporation into state outfits tacitly admitted failure and politicized the group. Films immortalized them as mystical heroes, sanitizing brutality and cementing legend across Nigeria and beyond. They became a cultural phenomenon, a symbol of people taking power back, for better or worse. Power so absolute and unregulated could not last. Excesses grew, personal vendettas, political thuggery, and public trust eroded. The federal government grew alarmed. A private army defied state authority. In 2002, the state prescribed Isakaba and ethnic militias. Police moved to disarm and disband them. Confrontations followed. Patrons left office. Successors shifted priorities. Without cover, the group waned. Some members were arrested. Others melted back into their communities. Though disbanded, the ghost lingered. Smaller groups invoked the name for fear or respect. Inadequate policing, slow justice, and poor opportunity left a shadow. If the state fails again, something even more brutal could rise. The cycle of violence and vigilantism was broken, but not defeated. The story of the Isakaba is a lesson about society's fragility and the social contract that binds it. Security is the bedrock of civilization. When government fails, a vacuum opens, and it will be filled. The Isakaba were a visceral consequence of state failure. People will create their own order, however brutal. Beware the lure of simple solutions. Swift justice cuts through corruption, but at the cost of humanity and law. Ends do not always justify means. Justice without due process is vengeance, and vengeance drags society down a dark slope. Their rise and fall argue for reform and a functional judiciary. The antidote to vigilantism is a state that works. Well-trained, well-equipped, accountable police. Fair, accessible, timely courts. Had these institutions worked, there would have been no Bakassi boys. Invest in the tedious, unglamorous work of strong institutions. The ghosts make us look in the mirror, showing the noble desire to protect community and the capacity for brutality when pushed to the edge. Their legacy is a permanent scar and a warning. The line between savior and killer can be as thin as the blade of a machete.